Now that we've defined inverse cosine, let's use that inverse cosine idea to do a few kind of quick computations. So here's some examples. So example A, I'd like to know what the inverse cosine of 0 is. Well, remember, I'm thinking backwards, so I'm not thinking, oh, what's the cosine of 0? What I'm thinking is, okay, if I'm between 0 and 180 degrees, what angle is going to give me a cosine that's 0? So, said another way, if we actually see the notation inverse cosine of 0 equals something, we'll call it t, then if I convert that to forward cosine notation, that would tell me cosine of t equals 0, with t between 0 and 180. And hopefully you remember that the angle that gives a cosine value of 0 is 90 degrees. Remember, on our unit circle, cosine is the x-coordinate, and x is 0 when I'm at 90 degrees or at 270. But 270 is outside of that 0 to 180 range that I'm allowed to use. So since 90 degrees gives me a cosine of 0, the inverse cosine of 0 then is 90 degrees. Letter B, inverse cosine of 1. So again, remember, it's not 1 degree, this is a value of 1, and so what I want to be thinking of is what angle gives me a cosine that's 1? What angle between 0 and 180 degrees? So, thinking another way, I'd say if inverse cosine of 1 is t, we can reverse the notation, and we're saying, okay, cosine of t equals 1, and so I want to know what angle between 180 I should put in for t. And hopefully you remember that the angle that gives us a cosine value of 1 is 0 degrees. Again, think of our unit circle, go over to 0 degrees, think of the x value because cosine is the x value, and notice that when I'm at 0 degrees, the x value is in fact 1. So the inverse cosine of 1 is 0 degrees. Letter C, inverse cosine of negative 1. So again, if the inverse cosine of negative 1 we call t, reversing our notation, that tells us then cosine of t equals negative 1, and my t has to be between 0 and 180. So I think about my unit circle. Where is the x value, because cosine is the x value? What angle gives me a negative 1? Well, I'm over at 180 degrees when I do that, right? Remember, over at 180, the cosine x value would be negative 1. So what we know then is the inverse cosine of negative 1 is 180 degrees. Last example, inverse cosine of 1/2. This one's a little trickier because I have to think about the values that I have. So again, if I think and reverse the notation, if I'm given inverse cosine of 1/2 equals something, we'll call it t, then that's the same as saying cosine of t is 1/2 with t between 0 and 180. So when I do this, I go, okay, one angle has a cosine of 1/2. Hopefully you remember it's 60 degrees. And so the inverse cosine of 1/2 is 60 degrees. Now I went through those rather quickly. You might want to go back and kind of look at them again. There's several questions like this in the book. Some will be inverse cosine, some will be inverse sine, and some will be inverse tangent, which we'll be talking about as we move through the section a bit. Make sure that you feel comfortable doing these in your head. It's really expected as you go through math classes that you're comfortable with this notation.